Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here with Chris. Chris is the host of the podcast Beyond Binary Thinking, a podcast I was recently on to talk about modern monetary theory. I highly recommend checking out that episode if you haven't already. Links in the description. It's a really great podcast. It focuses mainly on exploring the nuance beyond the debates in politics, philosophy, and economics. The host is also a socialist and co-founder of an embarrassingly successful software company, which is why he is talking with me here today about why he believes we're in a tech bubble that's about to burst. And I think this is a fairly relevant topic because now the stock market is crashing a lot, cryptocurrencies are crashing a lot, everything is down, inflation is up, the economy is in shambles. So with people talking about a tech bubble 2008 all over again, or dot-com bubble over again, I think it's relevant to talk about the tech bubble, and what better person to talk about than a person who has firsthand experience in the tech industry. Chris, welcome to the One Dime Podcast.
Hey, thank you for that wonderful introduction. So the first thing we have to pick you up on, I think crypto is often brought up as an easy target, right? It seems like the biggest hopes and the most nonsense and fluff. But I think crypto is just an extension of the tech industry in general. You'd be shocked how many companies are building almost nothing of value, making almost no profits whatsoever. And I think just Bitcoin and crypto and all that is just an extension of the realization that you can make more money just getting investment than actually having to do the hard work and making a product that has value that sells for a profit.
Yeah, that's something I would like you to elaborate on throughout the podcast, because a lot of things people are talking about how the economy now, capitalism, particularly in deindustrialized countries like the U.S., the U.K., Canada, and arguably the European Union also, is resembling a sort of like Ponzi scheme. Some people call it the Ponzi capitalism or gimmick capitalism. And how there's increasingly all these like companies that have a really convincing pitch, but not really much value to sell, and a lot of them don't even make profits. That's an interesting thing. And what you're describing though about companies being appealing in terms of the spectacle of it, the image, the brand, but not actually the product. Is this really new? Because isn't this kind of what happened in 1999 to 2000, the dot-com bubble, when the internet started, right? So everyone was so excited investing in all these companies. Some of them were interesting, some of them were bullshit. And then the whole thing came crashing down.
So nothing's new under the sun. But what I'm here to tell people is that it's worse than ever, and it's on steroids. That literally no lessons were learned from the last financial crash. In fact, quite the opposite. Obama, his first move was to put the people responsible in charge of the economy.
That makes sense. That's a smart thing to do.
And they unanimously voted to give themselves the bailout, unsurprisingly.
Really?
The Sachs team.
I would have expected they would put themselves in jail.
I don't want to get into that because that's well-trodden ground. But what really happened, the technocrats, neoliberals, what they decided to do in order to dig themselves out of that hole was to encourage innovation and investment in the economy. And so what they did is they put the current system on steroids rather than fixing anything that was broken. And they made it really, really cheap to borrow money if you were investing it in technology. And they made it really, really cheap to just not pay taxes if you were a tech magnate. And above a certain size. And so that's exactly the world that we see around us. That's why we've got these massive monopolies, Google, Amazon, Facebook. They've just dominated the space because they could just borrow money at an incredible rate, ridiculously cheaply, right? And never turn a profit. And the first bubble I want to pop here is the idea that, but this is innovative and innovation, and these companies are investing in other companies. And I can just tell you that working in a software space, right? Like, so I'm a co-founder of a company that makes a good chunk of money. And the way we do that is we avoid what's called Google's kill zone. So there's this idea that, oh, Google, because they're so big, they're always investing in good ideas and that's how they grow so big. No, Google is so big because they dominate a significant enough portion of the internet, and anything that might come and take attention away from them, take some profit away from them, they're more likely to buy it just to kill it. Right? Like, because acquiring a thing and then incorporating it into your stuff, that's all hard work, right? And that takes effort. But if you buy a thing, own the intellectual property rights, kill it, and then have a team of lawyers suing anyone that comes up with a similar idea, you win. And do you know how it
Doesn't
feels
Google?
like innovation is stagnating?
Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, well, doesn't Google own the Alphabet, right? The parent company of Google.
Yeah.
They own something like thousands of companies. And I think they own some AI companies that, from what I understand, haven't done a whole lot.
Well, there's two reasons for that. One is,
I think one is called, or
well, I mean, it plays chess good, but there's not much profit in that. What there is profit in is telling everyone we have an AI that's super smart, invest in us. And AI has been incredibly disappointing, right? And there's a few reasons for this. One is that it's a really hard problem, right? And we're perpetually disappointed. You watch sci-fi movies from 30 years ago. You're like, why aren't we living in that future? Right?
yeah.
And the reason is because it would take an incredible amount of resources and would be a very risky investment. And why would the people that have all of the resources want to do that when they're already ahead? Why would they risk half of their resources on a gamble that might not pay off?
You know, David.
That's one problem.
You know, David Graeber.
Oh yeah, big
he
fan.
has a really good essay called "Flying Cars and the Falling Rate of Profit," which he argues that, like, part of the reason why innovation has been so disappointing, especially in science and AI and stuff like genomics and these areas that science fiction movies in the 90s and even in the 70s depicted as like that. By the 2000s we would be living way more futuristically than we are now, and the life would be a lot better. And he argues that the only reason why capitalism ever was innovative in the first place was in the period, when it was most innovative, at least, especially like the US, the UK, the West, quote unquote, was to compete with communism, the Soviet Union. Because, for example, like going to space was never an idea until the Soviets did it. Apparently, the Soviets were the first to start cybernetics. Apparently, also, like what we know as the internet. Computers were kind of like started, but like never fully fleshed out. Smartphone too, I believe.
Oh yeah, most of this research comes from the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, the states.
Sure.
There's also books about that entrepreneurial state. But part of like what he argues is there's not a reason for the state to get as involved, and because now it's all left up mostly to the market, and with the state playing the role mainly of just lowering interest rates, so all these companies can get a bunch of free, like a bunch of cheap debt, so they're swimming in cash to circle jerk with. So like now, I mean, the companies, they're what incentive do they have to build really innovative things? Because innovative projects don't make profit at the start. They don't they take a very long time to make profit, like you said, especially like AI, right? So I mean,
it's a risky business, and honestly, what companies have realized, maybe some people are cynical and smart enough to have worked this out and be like, look, all we need to do is a shiny pitch deck, a bullshit thing. Then we show some growth, because when you buy a company at zero, right, the only way is up. All it has to do is show some lines going up, and it can go, wow, look, this shows real potential, and then sell it onto a bigger fall. In the investment world, there are people that are called smart money, right, and that's where you'll sell equity in your company, ownership in your company. for potentially even a lesser value than someone else could pay for it. But you'll do that willingly because you're like, oh, this person is a smart investor, right? Having them involved, they have connections, they have knowledge, they can really help my company grow. Do you know what in the investment world they call hedge funds, people's pension funds, or all the money retail investors put into these schemes? Do you know what they call that? They call it dumb money. It's the opposite of smart money. And the reason they call it dumb money is because it's very easy for them to just buy their friends' companies and just wash the money in a circle. They can use it however they want, and no one knows better. That is how they view. It's sold as the democracy of the open market. No, there's a few people that just circle jerk that money around frivolously to artificially inflate the value of their bullshit companies and Ponzi schemes. And tying into what I was saying before, like this problem just become worse because it's all become a tax write-off. It's all become it's never been cheaper just to share money around. And so, for an example, like the small niche I'm in, I am now one of the last 10 remaining companies of my size that haven't had a venture capitalist firm come in and buy everything out. And there used to be hundreds of companies like me, and there's now 10 left because everyone's just seen, oh, I'm in a growing industry, and the founders have been offered like an offensive amount of money for the work they've done, for the value they bring to the table. It's too much. And if I actually had to do on a chart, because look, we work in a marketplace, so it's like we sell via Amazon, right? But it's business to business. So there's a definite cap on how much money we could ever make or how much our company would ever be worth. And someone's buying companies 10 times what anyone reasonable would think. But it stopped making sense, and I've stopped trying to work it out, because what will happen is they'll sell it to another VC firm. And they'll sell it to another VC firm, and it's all just nonsense. And what gets really dangerous is when you start talking to people that actually know about finance. I mean, you heard recently about Elon Musk trying to buy Twitter, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how deep you dug into that, but the really interesting thing about an acquisition of that size is you don't actually have to give the money. You go to the bank and say, I'm about to buy Twitter. Twitter is worth the amount I said I'm about to buy it for. Therefore, please lend me that amount so I can buy Twitter
I'm aware of that.
for the valuation I just made it worth. Right? Like, the whole thing is nuts.
Like I heard a lot of the money that very rich people spend like on yachts and their vacations aren't actually money that they have through their liquidity. Sometimes it's literally just they take it from the bank, because the bank will give them that at low interest, and the bank will trust that they'll pay it back. So they just get more money.
To put this in household terms, right? Imagine your house is worth $200,000. I imagine neither of us own property, because who can afford that these days?
Yeah, no.
But imagine, right? I approach your neighbor whose house is worth $200,000. So I approach your neighbor whose shack is worth $1 million, right? And I say, I'm going to buy your house for $2 million. They're like, what the hell? That's incredible. Then I approach the bank and I say, and of course that person wants to sell me. Then I approach the bank and say, look, what a smart businessman I am. I've just just because I was interested in this house, it's gone from 1 million to 2 million. Please lend me the money to buy it. And then I approach a third person and say, hey, I've just driven the value of this house up. Would you like to buy it for 2.5 million? Look at the trend on the graph. It's going up. It's time to invest. It's a boom. And as ridiculous as that sounds, I mean, the funny thing is I was using it as a metaphor, but that kind of is what's happening with the housing market.
Well, that is literally kind of what happened. That's literally what happened in the 2007, 2008 crash. Like,
well, here's what's fucked though, right? And I didn't realize how the whole thing was tied together, right? Because people talk about the 2007-8 crash like it's historical, and they think we fixed anything or changed any laws to stop that happening again. But the opposite happened, and what's happening now is like BlackRock, right, big hedge fund, using people's dumb money, has decided to buy a bunch of real estate. They own a crazy amount of housing. That's driven the price up. The reason they did that is because they were heavily invested in office real estate in cities, which was a terrible investment and should go down. But they decided instead, let's make it go up. We have enough money to borrow enough money to make what should be a bad investment. All these offices sat empty, no one renting them out, right? Let's make the number go up. And it was really funny because I was talking to my friend who's also cynical about this whole House of Cards and telling him, oh, it's messed up because all these companies have bought all this real estate and they're using that to buy shares in companies, other companies, right? They're borrowing the money from the real estate they own and buying shares in other companies. And he went, oh shit, I just heard about it the other way around, where all these companies, because they're part of this portfolio of companies, are using that to buy in real estate. And I'm like, oh, so it really is like just a two-way Ponzi scheme. Everyone's double over leveraged. And I honestly keep telling people like Chicken Little that this bubble's about to burst, but I've been wrong for years. It just, the number keeps going up. And again, you said at the start of the podcast, oh, but now we're looking at a crash. Not really. Like the numbers have gone down for the first time in 10 years and everyone's losing their fucking minds. The numbers should go down. A normal stock market, you talk about bears and bulls, the stock market should go up and down, especially, by the way, when you have 2 years of economic recession, no one producing everything, everyone's staying at home hiding. The numbers should have gone down 2 years ago. And the fact that they didn't shows that the whole system is a farce.
Well, I'll clarify what my position is I think if capitalism was left to its own devices, if we're truly a free market system, capitalism wouldn't have would have been done at 1929. Like capitalism, if capitalism actually was free market and we had a quote unquote natural stock market, like it really wouldn't last long. I really don't think it would. And I think we were talking about how the lines are all going up, right? We're going up before. I think maybe for the audience, it's worth clarifying why the lines were even going up. Because, after 2008, the 2008 crash, Obama introduced a stimulus bill, but more importantly, right, the stimulus bill was able to give all these little tax write-offs to companies and also in quite literally corporate subsidies too. To people who met like certain dodgy requirements. But the most important thing,
forgiving the companies that had wasted loads of money and wasted loads of pension
buying their
money
debt too, getting the central bank to buy their debt. But like the big thing is lowering interest rates to near zero. And really, so they kept interest rates at a zero. And what that means for, the uninitiated, zero interest rates or near zero basically means that people can borrow money for very, very cheap. Now that it's not, hold your horses. Like for regular people, because it's still the bank's choice, the private bank's choice, whether they want to lend you money. They're not going to lend it to the poor plebs. They're not. And so they're going to, even though it's at zero interest, they're going to usually lend it to someone who will actually be like quote unquote likely to pay it back, so then they can make even more money. So what this ends up doing, low interest rates, they say it's to stimulate the economy. It's really what ends up happening is people with money use it to buy more assets, often not even innovating. Maybe they'll start some like dodgy company or whatever, like we're gonna get into. We're gonna get into that. Like I just want to explain like how the interest rates works, because for some people it's it's confusing why the market is going up. But yeah, the government's totally propping it up indirectly by lowering interest rates, and it lowers interest rates by inflating the reserves of banks so that banks can lower interest rates. For those who don't know, banks, when they give out loans, they create that money out of thin air. Hold that thought. Yep. Banks create money. It's not just the government. They create money. When they give out loans, that's not using someone else's deposits. That's literally new money. And this makes a whole lot more sense when you see like how this whole system is propped up. Yeah, it's private banks with the help of the government making shitloads of new money, and that is flooding the system. So what should be going down, like you said, yeah, of course. If the stock market was actually a reflection of the economy and like GDP and wages, it would be going down. And it went up increasingly during COVID after the huge stimulus bill and lowering interest rates even further. So
you say huge, it wasn't that big a stimulus bill.
Well, not for regular people, like, regular people got like $1,000 check, I think, just in the US. Yeah. But it was a pretty big stimulus bill for corporations. Like they spent a lot of money. But anyhow, with that, right? It's not a surprise why you see like the stock market go up, but wages don't go up. So that's just for the listener, right? Like, why is the market even so hot in the first place? And so I think now we can get to the point where we talk about what do companies do with all this debt that they're able to have, that all these loans they're able to get, all that cash they can take. What do they do with that? And
Well,
how does this tie into the rise of Ponzi companies and fake innovation companies? And you talked about Google,
yeah, well,
Facebook, and Amazon. Those are good examples. Like, those are the few good examples of companies that
yeah.
actually
I
provide
mean, I can
products.
talk about how terrible they are, but they actually do
Yeah, they
something,
do
right? Amazon
something, right? But
literally.
like, there's so much out there because people are talking about crypto. Like,
I'm here to tell you that most of it's bullshit, and crypto is just the more obvious example, right? What I think is beautiful about this whole thing is that for years, the finance industry has used jargon and incredibly convoluted technical language to make the whole thing opaque, right? It reminds me of the Catholic Church insisting on only speaking in Latin so that the plebs wouldn't understand what was being communicated, and so they were the only path to heaven. And likewise, for years, the finance industry has been like, oh, it's complicated. Economics, you wouldn't understand it, right? Yeah, of course. And there's finally come along an industry that can outplay them at their own game. And they're like, look, it's really complicated. It's technical. There's this technology that's going to just revolutionize this industry. Yeah, here's a guy that's so smart you wouldn't understand any of the words that come out of his mouth. Give us $1 billion now. And the bank went, well, I understood none of that. This must be worth a lot. And for those that think I'm cynical, like, it happens again and again and again. Blockchain's just the more obvious example, but you'd be, anyone that looks into it cannot believe how uninnovative, how stupid the market is.
the market's efficient. What are you talking about? That's what the economists in school told me. Is that the market's efficient and it sorts out the true values.
I can go through example by example by example, like WeWork, for example, which really just did not reinvent the office technologically. They just had offices with iPads at the front desk. That was really all they were doing, right? Like, just expensive offices with iPads at the front desk. There's so many companies that people know and love. Autonomous vehicles was an obvious one where they just overpromised, and 10 years later, where are these self-driving cars? Like,
If there is any like real innovation in capitalism coming from anywhere, I would see it from China, just because China is now, I think, the largest exporter of industrial robots, and they have like companies that the government directly, because the government and capital, there's no like separation. The government can like decide what the corporations want to do. So you have like Baidu, right? Baidu does have like self-driving car network. I don't know how important this is. For me, I'm like, why do we need this shit? Like, why don't we just have public transportation?
well, this is it, right? Like, so honestly, the autonomous vehicles are an incredibly tough nut to crack. And what they've worked out is the best way to do it is to rebuild all the roads so that they're all the same color and all the same size and all the same dimensions. And once you do that, that's really easy. But if you're going to do that, why not just build a train? Right, and that's what all these, like, Elon Musk and all these people who want governments to invest billions, right? Because they've run out of money to borrow from their mates who no longer believe in the project, so they go to the dumb money from the government. Yeah, invest in a train instead.
Why would we build a good railway system, a good like a good bullet train, like Japan has, when we can build a hyperloop?
And Hyperloop's just another road with a branded name. That's all it is. Like, it really is. Tunnels were invented before Elon Musk.
How stupid is Elon Musk? Like, I really wonder sometimes, because I've been watching a lot of videos recently about just like how fraudulent his whole shtick is, and how
So you know how
dorky.
Jordan
Yeah.
Peterson is a dumb man's intellectual. Yeah. Donald Trump is a poor man's rich guy. Elon Musk is an idiot's genius. You know the way they look at him. If you talk to anyone that's really deep into engineering, Elon Musk does sometimes come out with, like, he's, as you would do. Imagine if you were perpetually in further education and you could pay the smartest people on the planet to come and give you a TED talk twice a day. So Elon Musk sometimes comes out with something that smart people are like, he's onto something there. But if, like, half of his stuff about building a base on Mars, and it's like, Yeah, yeah, but do you know where's also important to be habitable and nice? Earth, and it has several advantages over Mars,
Like
like
water,
for human habitation.
nice air.
For starters, air, yeah. Like, so the idea that you're like, oh, or we could build this on Mars, you're like, but we have it here, but there's no profit for Elon Musk in us building habitable
You know
planets
what I
here.
find it's funny to me is that Elon Musk fans, I've had people really think Elon Musk is going to build a Mars colony by 2030. And I'm thinking, okay, you really think he's going to build something like that that's so unprofitable, but he's afraid of fucking unions.
No,
He's
but this
afraid
is
of
the genius.
Tesla unions, because like that will reduce his profit by, a certain amount. But he's also so altruistic that he wants to, build a Mars colony and save Earth.
Again, gonna have to correct you there. Like, you mentioned the word profit. Elon Musk is not interested in profit. Do you know how it's bizarre that Facebook's worth billions, but none of us pay for it, right?
Yeah, but Facebook does
And that's
make profits. Like Facebook and Google make massive profits.
Finally, recently, yes. But my point here is not about those two companies. But my point is that we are not the customers of Facebook. We are the product.
Yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So Facebook and Google have made profit because they've just killed the entire media industry, and they take all the money that used to go for advertising to print media and the news and that's now theirs. And what I'm saying is, with this, like, people think about, oh, how would we go to Mars and make a profit? Well, only if you think of selling the trips to Mars. But that's not what Elon Musk is in the business of doing. That's not how you become a billionaire. Elon Musk is worried about unions. The same reason why he's pitching to go to Mars, because he doesn't care about selling widgets for profit. He wants investors to give him billions. That's how he'll make more billions.
Right.
Like none of his businesses.
Well, it's like Uber too, right? Uber doesn't make a profit, but their stock went up like crazy. And that's his capital. Yeah. So like, I think a better way to say is that instead of profit, what Musk wants is more capital. And capital, you can get capital without profit, which is, to be honest, you know what's funny to me? I have an old video called, a year old, called "The Socialism of Warren Buffett." It's about like how the stock market works. Like, I never seen like a leftist perspective on the stock market, so I made a video, 40 minutes. One of my favorite videos. And when I was doing research for that, I tried to originally do a Marxist explanation of the stock market. And the more I did research, I was like, yeah, that Marx can't explain this. There's so many companies that don't make profit.
Well, because Marx was obsessed with value.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. These companies don't produce any value.
These people have realized, right, that that's an unnecessary luxury. Right? Like, you don't need to produce any value. You just need to sell the dream. Speaking of having a dream, like Martin Luther King said it beautifully when he said that, right, we have rugged individualism for the poor and socialism for the rich. I mean, you look at American football is a great example how you have the draft where whoever did badly one year gets a catch-up engine. Right, whenever you've got this oligarchy of rich people working together, it looks remarkably socialist. You know why? Because it's a good system. It's just not the system they want for everyone else.
Yeah, I mean, so you talked about, you talked about all these companies getting, a bunch of companies getting tons of, because of they have so much access to debt, cheap credit, and so much money to spend, and that they're not producing value. Give us some examples of like these Ponzi companies and how Silicon Valley is, and maybe outside of Silicon Valley, maybe in other countries too, is rife with it. Because one thing that people who always, the critics will try to bring up the few good examples. They'll try to say, like, say what one wants to say about Tesla, even though Elon Musk stole, like, he didn't invent Tesla, right? It was the company existed before he became whatever. But like with Tesla, people can say, yeah, that does have a value, right? Like, there's electric cars, even though they're not. That's not what's going to save the environment. Obviously, it's still like better. So, like, what are like some examples of the real trash?
But Tesla. Electric cars exist before Tesla, and Tesla is valued at more than the entire automotive indry combined.
That's the one thing I saw when I was researching for the Buffett video. I was like, this doesn't make any sense.
No, and this is people have lost so much money shorting Tesla because smart people who understand economics go, this doesn't make sense. But the stock market doesn't make sense anymore. We're past that point. It doesn't matter. And bet it all on Dogecoin.
But did it ever? Because in 1929, we also approached a situation where there was like massive overvaluations. The only difference is that the government didn't just bail out the whole stock market, they bailed out the economy. Now, notice how I use those things separately. So, like, what
Yeah.
was it?
No,
To what
it's
extent?
an important distinction
Because
there,
there's
right?
some people who will say like we're no longer in capitalism. I've been hearing a lot about the whole techno feudalism debate, and I really wonder like, were we ever? Like, maybe capitalism was always had a tendency to go bananas like this, and it's really the government that comes to the rescue.
So I think something that's really important to understand is the colonial aspect of global capitalism. And as long as there's an arbitrage, so you look at like the 70s, Nixon, Reagan, Thatcher, right? Like that era, there was money moving around between countries and taking advantage of underdeveloped nations, right? And so as long as there's that, there seems to be a genuine boom. And anytime there's not something to colonize, which is probably why Musk is obsessed with Mars, there needs to be colonization for the exponential, ridiculous growth. And yeah, like at the moment, we're looking at a place where, yeah, the only way to move it is into nonsense. And so that's what's happening.
Well, so
There's no new frontiers. We've tried with technology, right? So there was this massive influx of capital, and we tried cracking problems like flying autonomous cars, and we worked out that that was actually a really hard nut to crack. You wanted to ask about examples of companies that are entirely nonsense, and it's crazy how many happen, and it's a few a week now. So we're talking about companies that, if I told you they were worth billions, right? Like their valuation was billions. People had invested hundreds of millions of dollars in them, right? And what's happening more and more, because there's just this flood, happens in biomedical all the time. It all gets hidden because the idea of this system is that, oh, like, not everyone's going to be a winner, right? And it gets hidden by the fact that that's just part of entrepreneurial ship, right? Like there's winners and losers, and some, but what really happens with these businesses, as soon as they fold, they open up with the same people as a phoenix, start another one, get investment from some other VC fund. Are you familiar with Nate? Nate's just a
no.
beautiful example. So Nate told everyone that they could help be your personal shopping assistant using automation, right? And so the company was worth billions. They had hundreds and hundreds of staff, really expensive offices in New York and London. And pretty quickly, they just realized that they'd promised to solve a problem that's actually a really tough nut to crack. And it was much cheaper just to hire people in the Philippines to be, the term is called Mechanical Turk. Even Amazon uses this all the time. Often when you're told it's AI, it's just cheap labor.
Yeah, I've heard. I know about Mechanical Turk. Like it's what Amazon also uses for its like little drones that deliver pizzas or whatever, or deliver like goods from Whole Foods.
Jeff Bezos has even joked about people as a service, because software as a service is the thing, and he's like, actually, wink, wink, it's people. Isn't that funny?
Yeah,
like,
I mean, in that regard, I think the Marxism is still kind of relevant, because like you look at especially with Amazon, because right on the face of it, you see these little robots delivering people their goods, and it's like, oh, the automation is producing the value, but actually it's some guy in the Philippines operating that robot, and he's really producing the value, right?
And it ties into what Graeber said, we thought that there'd be innovation, but someone just worked out, actually, it's just cheaper to get someone in the third world to do it, rather than get a smart person to develop a new technology, which is expensive and risky.
I mean, it's interesting because the period where we often think now that now is the period where innovation is at the highest. That's actually not true at all. Innovation was actually at its peak in the 1960s, really after
I'm not surprised at all. And I have a theory about this. You've probably heard it. How socialist was World War II as an enterprise? Right, like at what point did we say, "Oh, sorry, we can't afford to invest in that because of the economy"? Right, World War II just had an entire nations of people who were educated for free, given free medical. Okay, there was a downside; lots of people died, but of course, people came together where a combined like goal, and then you had a bunch of people when World War II ended. You had all these people who are like, wow, they're all educated, they're all healthy, they've all got money, right, and they've all got skills, and God, the world needs fixing. Let's continue that momentum, right? Like, and you still had a lot of the government came from that military background as well, right? Where it's not like, oh, let's just shrug and hope the free market solves it. It's like, no, this is broken. Let's fucking fix it. The most social period, which ironically then followed with the Red Scare.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I have a similar theory, but I mean, it's not even like really we didn't even need to talk about it like theories. It's just like it's not hard to tell why automation was way faster in the period of 1940s up until the 1970s when the stagnation started to set in the 70s. And that's because one, you had unionization, right? So you had to demand higher wages, and when you have higher wages, companies have to look to automate things. There's a structural incentive, and back then there wasn't as many trade deals where companies could go and move factories to China, Vietnam, or Cambodia, or wherever, and then pay no tariffs. Or pay no quotas. So there's like back then there was just way more incentives to automate, whereas now, like you said, it's cheaper just to produce things in the third world. Why would you need to replace things with automation or develop technology? Often the way automation occurs, it's not so much like the robot just comes out of nowhere and replaces the human. It's more like the automation makes the work easier, or it'll fasten the productivity, or it'll just people will work alongside automation. Like, computerization is one of the most obvious examples, right? Like, look how like computers made being a secretary easier. Like, just think about that. So, but like
or being a housewife,
yeah.
right? Like washing machine, dishwasher.
Yeah, and there's all there were like, you really think about like the automation was really way more back then, even though now, because things we have the appearance of automation because we have social media, and we have I think but more than we have a innovation today, we have a culture of innovation. So like an ideology of innovation, because that's the thing that neoliberalism sold itself on is, oh, we're anti-bureaucracy, we're not like the Soviet Union, we let the free market enterprise. So it's literally the fucking simulacrum, completely detached from the real world.
And look, we're moving intentionally, I believe, although somewhat cynically, away from the innovation that the internet provided, right? If you look at Web 1.0, everyone was doing something, loads of different websites. Right now, you go on Google, you go on Facebook, you go on one of 5 websites, and all your information's there, right? So, and this is just the monopolization of it by big corporations. Again, allowed by this free money that they had more access to than others. They could buy up their competitors. They could buy up any threats. And even if they lost money, it didn't matter because they could borrow so money. These companies are at a point now, I don't know if you're familiar, that they don't actually use their money because that's too slow to come out. So they borrow money for their just because they borrow money at such a cheap interest rate compared to how quickly they're growing. That just for cash flow it'd be ridiculous. So they just forever borrowing money. Like forever, which is all going to collapse because one day that they won't be able to pay it back. But that's great because that's the bank's
Here's
problem.
the thing. I think I'm even more cynical than you are, I guess, in this one respect, because you said it will all collapse. And I think if capitalism is left its own, like if the government wants to let it collapse, it will collapse. It should have collapsed, right? And like you said earlier, is a small market drop like now is nothing really when you think about where valuations actually are. Like valuations are still like way higher than they should be, and there's still so much trash in the economy. But really, here's the thing, from an MMT perspective, if the government wants it, it can do even more than just lower interest rates, because there's one, it can have negative interest rates. That's a possibility where people actually get paid to borrow, which is insane. That hasn't been tried yet, and it could happen. It very well could happen. Or
there's an argument that that's what the private businesses are doing right now. But sure.
Or I would like to hear more about that. But the government could just get in much more directly and just straight up hand them checks. I mean, it's possible. is it totally is possible. The thing is, I'm not a person in this regard. I guess I'm not very Marxist, because in my view, I'm a Marxist politically, right? In terms of some of the solutions, but in terms, I think Marxists share too much with Austrian economists in that they take value too seriously. And you might agree, because you've seen firsthand how some of these companies don't actually produce value. And I think they can get away with that. The government can literally just keep this bullshit economy going. It can. And that's the scary prospect, which is why I'm not a person who thinks that, like, oh, it'll all come crashing down. It might, but it also could just be artificially kept there like a zombie, So I think we could just see this privatized Keynesianism, right? Continue socialism for the rich. I could see it continuing. And you think about the incentives, because there's two parties, right? Two parties that are very similar, both equally influenced by corporations. I'm talking about the US, but you could say a lot of the same with the UK, right now.
Sure.
Is But for elections, they want to, the economy, quote unquote, like the stock market, to do better. So they have the incentive to just keep this bullshit going. There isn't an incentive to let it crash, because then whoever is the president under that crash will for sure lose the next election.
Well, I mean, and this is the problem, right? So imagine somehow, despite the fact that we got very close with Bernie Sanders, and then the UK with Jeremy Corbyn, somehow we get a moderate socialist in power, right? And they do any checks and balances against any of these people. That's, you described, unless they have an incentive for it to crash. That's all the incentive they need. All they need is to have 2 bad years, which everyone will be crying about it, right? Like a bunch of, and this is how the 1% sees it, a bunch of 10%ers will lose a bunch of money and be crying. But really, the 1% will just buy the dip and be fine. And then the next president will be hardcore reactionary ultra right.
Well, that's kind of what happens whenever stock markets crash. Is like, you've seen people talk about inequality. The inequality has been increasing really since the 70s. And people say that Reagan years, but it's before. But people, I want.
This is my terror, right? Imagine people, working conditions get worse and worse and worse. People unionize. There's an economic crash, and everyone goes, "See, it was those damn unions." And you're like, "What was it? Really?"
Then you get a Pinochet situation. Yeah, that's terrifying prospect. But then here's the thing: what would the fascists do in power? They would just inflate the economy again. They would inflate. They would not. I should stop saying the economy. The stock market is not the economy.
Oh yeah, it's not the economy. No. Like I keep telling people this when they say, "Oh, but GDP went up under Trump." Even if you don't like him, I'm like, GDP goes up when someone gets cancer.
GDP doesn't matter anything. Like, the GDP
should not be a measure of anything good.
The GDP can go up, and it can go all to 10% of people.
Yeah. Literally, I think when there's an oil spill, GDP goes up. Like, there's nothing good about GDP.
But what's weird is the stock market's even more detached from like GDP. When like London reported that GDP went down, the stock market went up, because they apparently, like, a lot of people, a lot of investors predicted that the central bank was going to get scared and then give them more money to play with.
And the old argument is, but people's pensions are in the stock market. Talk to the average 30-year-old or below. How much are they investing in their pension right now? How seriously do they consider themselves invested in the stock market and their pension? Like, it's a dying argument that is terrifying.
I mean, why not, like, instead of, I always hate that argument. It's like, oh, you have to keep this going because, people's retirement are wrapped up into this. Why don't you just give them a retirement that's publicly funded directly?
Man,
like, Jesus, it's not that hard, but
I'm drifting into the dark place here. Like, come on, pull me out of this. Give me something positive.
Okay, so there's something I was about to say before, but I kind of forgot. But I think this system, what's scary enough, could continue going, and that's where I'm not a person who thinks there'll be like one big crash. There could be, and with the Democrats, as the ways things are looking now, they're raising interest rates a little bit, right? And that's part of why that is mainly the reason why the stock market is crashing now. Not even a real crash, but like dipping, like how much? Like probably I think 28% year to date, 28%. That's
Yeah,
bear market. That's
but
a bear
again,
market.
I mean, sure, but that's a misleading number because what I always say is, where like go backwards in time, where is it compared to where it was before? And if the answer is like, oh, 2021, I'm like, I just don't see the panic, right? It's at levels it was in
Well,
2021.
the
I'm
reason why
like,
it's panic is a lot of people started investing in 2020. Like, think about all the people
yeah,
because of the market was going up so fast. Everyone suddenly thinks they're a fucking stock picker. Everyone starts investing.
I know. I heard everyone talk about how much money they're making, how smart they were, and I was like, stop it. Like, look at what's happening in the world. The numbers shouldn't be going up right now. Like, it's just wrong.
Yeah, it is. It is. But the thing is, there's actually more. So, okay, there's now I remember what I was trying to say before because we mentioned that inequality goes up during economic crashes. And this is a thing that's often like not talked about. I notice among progressives as to biggest causes of inequality. Yeah, lowering taxes obviously increases inequality, obviously. But there's actually something even more insidious. So whenever the market crashes, what ends up happening is a redistribution of wealth from like the top, I don't know the exact percentage, but let's say the top 5% to the top 0.001%. So like whenever the market crashes, the people who have lots of money will just buy that dip and they'll get even richer. But then a lot of people lose money. Where it's not so much like all capitalists are winning or losing. But like in market crashes, it's a redistribution of capital and thus a redistribution essentially of power. So like this is what's insidious too, is like whenever the market crashes, it also it's a new redistribution of wealth. It's like a reordering of capital and power.
Yes, but like if you look historically, um, there is some of that. There's arguably like the 5% takeover from the 1% sort of thing during that time, right? Like there's a sort of changing of the guard a bit, and then you also have, you know, a lot of angry people. Look at the Great Depression, and what followed was the New Deal, the French Revolution. Lots of things followed that. Same with the Russian Revolution, and I think, just as there's no atheist in a foxhole, so they say, there's no libertarian in a Great Depression, right? So a lot of the ideas we're having now, a lot of these tech bros who've, been able to afford to believe that they don't need the state, despite all the obvious advantages it's given them paved along their way. Those arguments will just die a death if there ever is a proper Great Depression. And I do actually have some hope and some positivity to pull us out of the dark space. The other trend I'm seeing, and Marx talked about this actually, when you have a new technology or people that have a monopoly due to like high skilled labor, right? And this was really interesting when I started looking into this because I thought, tech is so new. Marx didn't take it into account. And it's brilliant reading through to realize that nothing is new
And
under
he
the
also
sun.
took that into account, literally volume
Yeah,
3.
there are highly skilled. Yeah, there are highly skilled laborers due to new technology, and here's the patterns that happen. Here's how.
Marx was too optimistic about automation. That's the thing people don't understand. He really thought capitalism was innovative, and that whenever the rate of profit would lower, there would be an incentive to automate labor and to, basically cut the amount of labor needed and labor time. And this was like sort of like an acceleration to socialism. But the thing was happening, there isn't actually an acceleration. Like capitalism is stagnating. It's like I would call it decadence almost.
Okay, but here's the positive that I think will pull us out of this tailspin of the fun. Is that because there's this technocracy backed up by incredible wealth, right? They have absolute monopoly, and so we see the stagnation. But something that's really happening with software development. If you think, 20 years ago, what percentage of people could develop software compared to now, compared to 10 years? And if you look at how software languages are progressing, it used to take years and years to learn how to do quite basic stuff. Now, 2-month course, you could be making your own software that could have value and actually add value to the economy. And so I think we're going to move into a brave new world where sort of the keys are more broadly distributed, and where anyone will be able to develop software. It will be literally child's play. People will type just as we now do with words on a keyboard, right? The printing press used to be owned by monks and a few special rich people. Now everyone has the ability to type and communicate. And I think it will be literally the same with the production of software. It will be democratized in the hands of many. And there will always be monopolists and capitalists taking advantage of niches, but a lot of the wealth that's being consolidated in the hands of so few, that will come to an end as more and more people enter this age where everyone has the right and the ability to create their own computer software.
So, what you just said, a lot of people said when the internet was invented, and that the internet was kind of inherently communist and that it would lead to open source software. But then you got intellectual property, right, which kind of killed that dream. I agree that a lot of the technologies or infrastructure that exists today under capitalism can be used for socialism, and much better under socialism. And also, I do think that, for example, the fact that you have so much the digitization of the economy makes it so easy to transfer wealth. Because everything is digital now. It's so easy to transfer wealth, to nationalize, collectivize, or give power to the workers. Right? There's so many. It's a People's Republic of Walmart by Lee Phillips, and it is a book that talks in depth about how easy it is. Lenin also famously said that monopoly capitalism makes it easier to transition to socialism. But here's the thing: I don't think any of this is inevitable. It depends on whether, really the working class or a big section of the working class can take power. And I think it requires regime change, if we want to call it and put it in those terms. Is like a regime change, a change in power is required. I don't think any of this is inevitable, which I guess in this regard makes me sort of like Leninist. But yeah, I think none of it's inevitable unless the actual dynamics of power are shifted to make that possible. I think, yeah, the world can be way better, if humans are actually able to operate to their full potential. But I don't think it's inevitable, if that makes sense. Because look, intellectual
before
property.
We get into yeah, fair enough. But before we get into Leninist revolutions, we will live in a world where the village returns. Right, people will be able to live near their families, work remotely from anywhere. We're already getting a point now where anyone that can develop software is demanding more of a salary than people that were managers 5 years ago. Right, like the actual producers of value are getting paid more than their bosses. Like and that's shifting. And again, this has happened in history. Right, like there's just such a high demand for a certain skill. The scales tip for a little bit, and absolutely you're right. Like until there's a Leninist revolution, like inevitably something will roll, and the seesaw will swip back in the favor of the heaviest. But yeah, I do think we'll live in a world where less of the commute to big industrialized cities. It's a change from the industrialization of the 1920s that Marx was writing about, and it's a somewhat brave new world where people are bringing an enormous amount of value, able to work anywhere, able to potentially have more leisure time because the amount of value they bring with their work.
Well, I think.
And you want to talk about a revolution?
Well,
I don't know. That's another.
That's another topic. That's way too complicated. But I would say right there with working from home, I think does in many ways the pandemic allowed for more innovation than capitalism did in the last 5 years.
Yes.
And like one of that was working from home, and I think working from home is fantastic. I work from home, so it's much better. It's much more environmentally better. Also, just like the closing of so much of the economy during COVID, we saw the biggest decline in emissions, I think in history. Like one of the big,
I mean, still not enough, but
it was quite a lot. Like really, like more people apparently in China were saved from the air being less polluted than
than died of
Yeah.
COVID. Yeah, it's incredible. But I just feel like in labor terms, it feels more like we're in a buyer's market than a seller's market, or the other way around, seller's market than a buyer's. I don't know what the metaphor is there, but you get what I mean, right? Like if it feels finally like the shoe's on the other foot for a bit, and that hasn't been the case in a long time. You're looking at the Great Resignation, right?
Yeah. But what I would say is I always like to shift the emphasis on power, right? Because one thing, for example, we're talking about open source software that can easily be shifted with intellectual property as it has been, right? Already.
I wasn't talking about open source software. I was talking about the fact that the ability to develop software will become easier and easier and easier, and the barriers to entry.
Right.
You
Yeah.
won't. You used to need a 4-year degree, and that
You
was
can learn
very
on the
limiting,
internet.
right?
I mean, I learned editing entirely on YouTube, which surprises
Yeah,
some people. They're
yeah,
like, "Oh, did you study the animation or something?" Nope, not at all.
yeah.
Literally learned in 2020. But I agree with that. There's many progresses for sure. But also, with working from home, I notice a lot of companies are putting people back to work in person, even though it's less efficient. And that's because it's because of power. I think I see it's because of power, because you can.
They're trying, but it feels like a losing thing. And although you used to have one factory in your city, right, that you had to work at, that was your only option, or you had to leave your family behind, and for years that was happening, and everyone had to move to the bigger cities. And now I see more and more. I know in my company, I'm recruiting people all the time who they're working for these big companies that got acquired by this big VC, and they crack the whip and tighten the nuts, and they're like, I need to squeeze more out of you. You need to work more, and they can find a job with smaller companies. There's more and more smaller companies.
Yeah, but these are skilled workers, though.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. But again, it's becoming less and less of a niche skill, and
Easier
more
to
and more
get
of a
the
common
skills,
skill.
is what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that is good in that regard for sure. The thing is, though, with the Great Resignation, I think a big part of that had to do with COVID, obviously, but the fact that especially in Canada, I mean, I was trying to think. The U.S. did get stimulus checks, just way less, but in Canada we got about $2,000 a month. And this,
yeah, we were the same in England. Anyone that couldn't work was paid their normal salary or 75% and said it's okay, stay at home.
And a lot of people were able to switch jobs, quit jobs, and this gave a lot of power. And the irony, right, is that this was done to save capitalism so that people can go buy shit, but it was also gave more power to working people, which is a contradiction of capitalism. And capitalism is filled with contradictions. And this is part of my theory as to what I think eventually we'll get to the point where governments will more and more need to introduce some sort of basic income. I think basic income, because it won't be universal, it'll probably be watered down at first. And they'll do it because it's to deal with the falling rate of profit problem, so people can consume more bullshit. And but this also poses a contradiction because it gives workers more power, right? That's why they're so afraid to do this. I saw some like Republican politicians say that no, it was a Canadian politician who said CERB, which is the free money stuff, whatever the checks we got, is the reason why UBI is a bad idea, and it's because he saw like the wave of unionization and the Great Resignation. So it's I think if there are contradictions in capitalism that can be exploited to further society and to further the prospect of socialism. And I put it in the terms of power because that's like the key thing. But there's also the government, right? The state has to be no longer in the hands of the capitalist class, because I think as long as it is, whether directly in the case of the US or indirectly in the case of most countries, it's usually indirect. I think they can keep this Ponzi scheme going, right? Which is a scary prospect.
I'm shocked how little I disagree with you. And, just for context, because you opened with saying how it's sort of weird that I'm a co-founder of a business and a socialist, and it is a rare combo. But I sort of came at it as I was learning more and more about economics through my study for the podcast. And I just sort of saw how capitalism was failing and dying, and not even from like this lefty opinion. I was just like, it's just not working. Austerity, for example, right? No one would ever run a business according to neoliberal austerity. Right, you'd be like, oh god, if we just fire everyone and cut all our costs, hopefully the business grows. No, it's the least business plan ever, right? Business is all about, as we've said, borrowing money so that you can invest to grow. And that just doesn't seem like the government has any such intelligence for any such plans at all. They're all about just trying to cut themselves out of the job they got hired to do, right? And so I came into this really as a capitalist trying to save capitalism from its worst excesses. And then the more I've researched and the more I've studied, the more radicalized I've become. Firstly, just climate change. But the other one is, I just don't see, as you said, how any gains will happen, even if it's for the benefit of the system, even if it's for the benefit of democracy. I've been talking to my capitalist friends and saying, but if we believe in democracy and we believe in making this country richer and more prosperous and better to live in, shouldn't we do this? And it's like, no, but that all sounds a bit lefty. And I've just realized that no gains will happen as long as you said, the capitalist class is in charge, because they're just so myopic and it's such a small group of people and such a concentrated force of power that they can't see to make things better for everyone, because that's a risk to their power and their status. They can't allow democracy to live. They can't allow prosperity to live, because all of that threatens what they have on the world. So, shocking as it is, I have sort of come around to the way that there needs to be a revolution, and it probably won't be peaceful.
I truly also think that capitalism has outlived its usefulness.
Like they say of communism, right? It's nice in theory, but it doesn't work in practice. And that's what I keep saying about capitalism. It was nice in theory, it just didn't work
well,
out.
The difference is, I think the difference between, right, quote unquote, communism and capitalism and their failures is that for communism, the failure of communism is like a tragedy, because it won, like, achieved a lot, and also it was supposed to be a lot better. Whereas I think, like, when socialism doesn't work well, it's when it's less socialist, when it's more hierarchical and less democratic, right? Whereas when capitalism's worst aspects are its features.
Yes, not a bug. As we say in software business, that's not a bug, that's a feature.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, I think if anyone who cares about human evolution can clearly see why would anyone still believe in capitalism anymore? I mean, especially if one is into like innovative software and science, especially. I noticed some of the people who I'm friends with personally who've been very radicalized are people in science, like STEM and biotechnology, because they see how capitalism just gives no incentive at all, to build anything of real value, because like all these projects are not profitable in the short term, and you have to make all these pitches and sell in the companies that do well, like CRISPR, if you heard about CRISPR.
I do, and I have friends who work in it, and the most tragic thing they said to me is that most of their job was killing enough animals to check enough boxes so they could launch a product as soon as possible and say they go.
Yeah, it's so depressing, because they get all this like stupid capital from like idiot investors with nothing left to do, invest in, and then they have to focus more on like basically bluffing. Yeah. I mean, have you? I have to ask now, just because I had this in the back of my mind when you kept talking about like the image being more important than the real thing, and how so much of this economy is based on companies being able to pitch and sell themselves rather than sell a product or make a valuable product. And I'm curious, have you heard of the book Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord?
No, I have not.
Yeah, this is like, think of this book. It's a classic book. It's really hard. I find it's really unnecessarily hard to read. Like the first chapter is really all you need, to be honest. Like, but you can find a lot of people talk about it. A lot of people cite it.
Oh, just my hack for people listening as well is if you can find the author going on a podcast, they normally reveal the main preface of their book.
That's true. That's another hack. Except the problem is this guy is dead.
Oh, he's not going on any podcast.
Yeah, and he was writing in 1969, I believe this book was published, and or 1967 actually, and it's very ahead of its time. One of the key themes is that we went from a society first of being to having, and this is like the start of consumer capitalism, late 1800s, early 1900s, consumer capitalism. Then from having to showing. So it doesn't even matter whether you actually have. It's not even the success that matters or how much, it's your appearance. And we see this, we're this can be applied just to like capitalist innovation here, but a big phenomenon I also find interesting is how there's a huge phenomenon of people who want to like appear very wealthy but actually aren't.
Oh, sure. And look at the whole influencer Instagram, but all of us are there, man. We're all in a rental society. No one can afford to buy shit anything. So everything you're doing, someone else owns, and you're just renting it, right? What is Airbnb and yeah, but not just that. No one can afford to own anything now. We're all renting it off someone else.
Yeah, and it's also just the increasing it because of so much of communication is image based too. It creates a massive incentive. I mean, this is why I don't know how anyone can still believe in value anymore. When people talk about value investors,
Yeah.
like they'll be like, "Oh, I'll invest in this valuable company; it'll do well someday." It's like, okay, maybe.
Well, yeah, I do laugh when people are like, and again, it's most obvious in Bitcoin, but trust me, the whole tech thing's the same. It's like, just believe in the fundamentals. And
Yeah,
like
believe
all
in the
my friends who just
fundamentals.
invest, all my friends who invest in shit coins for the lols, and they always make more money than any sensible investor because that's the game now. It doesn't make sense to invest in the fundamentals. It's nonsense. There are no fundamentals. Tesla is not worth more than the entire auto industry combined. Dogecoin is not worth more than the output of most countries. Like, it's just nonsense.
Well, you know what I find very interesting is
The
how
emperor's wearing no clothes, and it's obvious.
I was first looking when I was first looking into investing. I was looking into a lot to Warren Buffett's career, right? Because he's considered one of the most successful investors of all time, and I've actually found out that it's really since this is so such a not it's I don't believe it's a coincidence, but since 2008, Buffett has failed to actually beat the market. For those who know, is like beat the market if you just invest in the stock market, which is like buying all the top 500 stocks or all the stocks in the
Yeah,
market.
yeah.
You just usually get a return of, I don't know, like 4 to 10%, give or take. And if you beat the market, you're considered usually a good investor. And some people who have invested in complete crap have made like 60%, 100% returns. And meanwhile, Buffett has made very average returns, like very like 5% returns. He's investing in valuable companies, and that's not his fault. He's doing all the right things that used
He's
to
too
work.
conservative, bro. To the game now, right? Even if you're not, say, Dogecoin investing in shit coins for the memes and the lols, right? The game, and you literally hear them say, people like Peter Thiel, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You don't want to invest in 10 companies because
Wait, that's
you
not
don't want to
Peter Thiel. Is
invest.
that Peter?
No,
What's
no,
that?
God, no. Peter Thiel is a high risk. You're talking about people who are like, the economy's going to crash,
Yeah,
bro. What's a
who's
safe
that guy's
harbor?
name? I forget. There's that one guy, Peter Schiff. That's the guy who was always like the fundamentals, man, the gold, man. He
No,
still
yeah,
believes
no.
in value.
That's such an old game, right? Now what people say is you should have, well, first step one, have $1 billion, right? Because otherwise the strategy doesn't work. Step two, invest in 100 companies that are most of whom are likely to fail. And they literally describe it as they have no interest, like a company like mine, which makes a product that people want and sells it for a profit, they are so bored of. Right, they have no. Like, that's some old school Warren Buffett shit. Get out of here with that nonsense. Right, what they want, and they literally describe it, is a company that's prepared to jump off a cliff, right,
Mm-hmm.
and build an airplane on the way down. Because they'd rather you fail in 6 months having lost 10 million, and then they go, cool, didn't waste any time on that. And occasionally, some company, perhaps through luck, perhaps through hard work, but all of those companies jumping off that cliff do it. Mostly what just happens is that numbers look good enough. It's not that that company starts making money, but then you can say to someone else, look at the numbers on this graph. Would you like to invest in this? When I bought it, and you were talking, this is the nonsense of Elon Musk approaching Twitter, saying he might buy it. The value goes up. Then he approaches a bank, borrows the money, and then he can then sell some Twitter shares onto some other people and make a profit. Despite all the fact that he's done is just said, I'm Elon Musk and I'd like to buy this. And I'm not even going to use my money to do it. I'm going to use the money of the company I want to buy. And because I said I'd buy it, the value goes up. And because the value goes up, I can borrow more money then to buy the next thing. The whole thing is nonsense, but they've just realized that that is so much more profitable a game than trying to build a widget that people like. Because as soon as you're building a widget that people like, China can copy it cheaper. So they see that as a losing game. They're like, right, instead of making products, make shiny things that I can sell to rich people. The society of the spectacle.
Very well put. And with regards to, I think Buffett's investing career is kind of a manifestation of like the way the economy has evolved or devolved. And I because he started investing in the 1940s when a lot of people were scared to invest still because there was the World War II, and also the memory was not too distant of the 1929 crash. And this is where the government was more focused on building the actual economy than the stock market directly, right? There was like a jobs guarantee. I'm not trying to say everything was great, because this is still like incredibly racist. Like blacks never really felt the benefits of the welfare state and whatnot. I got to point that out. But
Sure, but even as a racist ethno-state, they were trying to make it better for the white people.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Whereas now, and here's my thing: last economic crash, right? Obama bailed out Goldman Sachs, brought them in, had them running the show. I'm just terrified, right? Next time the economy crashes, well, let's face it, probably Trump or someone worse will be in power. And what they're going to do, bring Elon Musk and encourage him to run the US Treasury? Probably. For the memes, for the lols.
I mean, so with Buffett, right? He started investing, and at this time, so there's not a lot of people investing, so he's automatically has an advantage, first mover advantage, there, yeah. Right? But also, like, the government is focused on building the economy from the ground up, like in the sense of it's actually like investing in labor, and labor, creates the things, right? And he's investing in that type of economy. Of course, he's a value investor, right? And that's why it worked for him. Like, he was so successful. That's where he made the bulk of his fortunes. The only reason why his fortune grows now is because he has so much money that a meager 5% return is enough to give him like 100 million a year. So like, because that's the nature of the stock market, is it's exponential. And he's getting old,
slowing down. It's hard to spend 100 million a year. You've got to work hard.
But what I mean is, what's interesting, right, is I remember I was paying a lot of attention to the whole value investor versus the speculative investor thing. It was just interesting to me to see how there's a lot of people like, Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, that's his like pal, who's also a similar type of investor, similar age. And with Charlie Munger, he made a big bet on Alibaba, I think in 2021 or 2020. And Alibaba, right, is a company that does produce a lot of value and does make enormous profits off of the backs of the Chinese workforce, right? It creates value in the classic Marxist sense, right? And also probably in other ways too. Alibaba is huge. It's a company of value. But Alibaba's stock continued to stagnate, and it did not. Meanwhile, you have Tesla going up. It makes no sense, but it's in this like gimmick.
But again, everything's relative, right? Like, so Alabama's probably performing well, but something that's new and shiny is going to grow faster. The same as 40 years ago, Chinese economy was growing fast, and so money had to move there. And it's the same thing, right? Money always moves towards whatever's accelerating fastest, and new shiny things will always grow faster than a big. At some point, it's very hard when you're a 10 billion a year company to double. Like, where do you go? Growth becomes, the cost per acquisition gets higher and higher and higher and higher. So, yeah.
It's also because he believes in value.
Are entirely sensible. Yes. And it's just a shame, I think, that the economy has moved beyond that.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because Walmart's also an example of a company that produces value in the classical sense, value built off the backs of workers, but also is a stock that does not move at all. Like, it is like not as, if you invested in Walmart, you would not have made money at the time where like all these like shit coins were making tons of money. And
again, that used to make sense. The stock market goes up, the stock market goes down. I used to think that on average your investments would do meh and not really make much money. But everyone now demands an aggressive 10% return and is furious with the president if that's not happening.
Now, here's my, because I think a good way to conclude this is like, how could this pan out? And the thing is, I think, yes, the gravy train could keep going because it's a fake economy anyway. Like, the government can, even bring in negative interest rates, literally pay people to borrow money. Like that's totally possible. It could keep going. But I think the Democrats are having a Jimmy Carter moment right now. Like in the sense that Joe Biden, like, I think still believes in like doing the right
Yes.
thing, right? And kind of like
So he's like, "Whoa, stop this ride! It's making me dizzy. This doesn't make any
yeah.
sense anymore." Yeah.
Yeah, and what's interesting, right, is I mean, it's also fueled by just economic illiteracy and the fact that his cabinet is filled with neoclassical economists who are not the brightest when it comes to inflation, like very out of touch dinosaur economists. So because you have all this inflation happening due to a wide variety of factors, this is summarized. Like one, it would be the Ukraine-Russia war, because that is increasing gas prices. When gas prices increase, the price of fucking anything you import and anything you transport goes up. Obviously, right? You have to pay more for transportation, higher oil costs, everything is more expensive. Also, with the pandemic reopening, you have a whole bunch of demand, but you have less supply than you did pre-pandemic because so many businesses closed down, and you have less competition, and you have more power to set prices. Companies price gouge, right? So you have inflation due to and also you have supply chain because China is still closed down, everything's delayed, higher transportation costs, higher prices. You have inflation, right? The government tries to respond to this by raising interest rates, which will do fuck all. That will do fuck all about these external factors that are causing inflation. But they think it might.
It's the only lever they have left, right?
Well, it's the only thing that they can that the central bank can do, but it's not. The government can, the government can set price controls. It could import less. There's also things the federal government can do.
Oh, if they had power and weren't scared of
Yeah.
all the corporate backlash that would
course.
happen. And let's be clear, the corporations own all the newspapers at this point, so the backlash would be terrible.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, because people wonder how the Soviet Union had like zero inflation ever, and it's because it's controlled all the prices, dude. That's why. And I'm not saying that's a good thing necessarily. Like I'm not saying that kind of government control over the whole economy is necessarily a good thing. Like I'd prefer a worker economy.
No, but it's not also the reason for all of the poverty, right?
No, of course not.
The free market economists say that the reason we're so wealthy and prosperous and they were so poor is because of the free market.
It's actually because it's funny you mentioned imperialism earlier, which is one of the big reasons for capitalism's success, because we can seem a lot richer than we are because we can buy bananas and like all sort of things super cheaply because they're made by like slave labor. Right. So like our wages cannot go up, but our buying power can go up because of imperialist exploitation. So yeah, but I mean, this is the funny thing, right? The reason why I brought up inflation is because the government is raising interest rates. Well, I have two theories. I think they're either stupid or they're trying to lower inflation expectations by raising interest rates. So it'll make people set prices lower. But regardless, this slight tiny raise in interest rates, you have like tiny bit less cheap money going out there. Suddenly the market's tumbling, which is funny because it shows how like fake it was to begin with.
Precarious the whole thing was in the first place. Yeah, it's like, and look, I think the problem as well is that you talked about and I actually loved it, when you out cynic someone and I say, "Oh, this whole house of cards going to collapse," and you're like, "I don't agree with any of your premises, but everyone's so invested in this lie and Ponzi scheme that it could still continue to go up." But I think the problem is, it's always the criticism of Keynesian economics. I think it was Hayek, as other people as well, who says that business realizes when government's printing money. And they go, or when government's offering to bail people out, as they did in the last recession, right? And they respond to that and go, "Cool, we can take more risk. We can play this fake game. We can get involved in this Ponzi scheme. And we don't have a strong SEC. There's no one that's going to call us to rights. There's no one that's going to stop this crazy Ponzi. So let's double down on it. Let's go crazier. Let's inflate things more." And so I think you're right. Like, things will get worse before. I don't know if they get worse or better. I don't know which one's worse or better at this point. Things will get crazier before they make sense. I'll put it that way. But it has a tendency to just like accelerate so much that it just will look like a mental. When people are starving in the streets and companies are 10xing monthly worth trillions. Like I say, if we have anyone who has any old school sense in them. They'll be like, "Stop this crazy ride! Stop it right now!" But if we not only have a meme economy and a meme based political system, then maybe we'll just yeet to the moon. Who knows?
I mean, it's possible, right? I mean, I will push back on the one thing is
Or
I
to
wasn't.
Mars, sorry.
I don't think
to Mars.
I don't think it was Hayek who said that, but like a lot of libertarians say that now, like about like the problem with government. But with Hayek, the argument was more he thought that workers would get too much power and demand too high wages. That was literally and
fashy as fuck.
And also, well, I mean, in the case of Hayek, his mentor von Mises literally supported the Austrian Fascist Party, right? Quite a libertarian.
Not surprised to hear it.
So, but like his other argument was that if the government gets too involved in setting prices and regulating it becomes socialism. And but his idea of socialism was like government doing stuff. So his idea of socialism was Soviet Union. So
a Fox News view of socialism.
Yeah, but like the thing is I actually think that's kind of true. Like that, I think he is kind of right. Like that can happen. Doesn't mean it will. Like Roosevelt happened to be a billionaire, and most of the Democratic politicians were very anti-communist. But I mean, I do think that like increased government involvement has that ability to do that. Like that's why people are so scared of price controls. Because if the government can set prices, what else can they do? You know, or if they're scared of UBI even.
It reminds me of my favorite meme though, right? Like because yes, it's one of the reasons why inflation might happen. It's clearly not the reason inflation's happening now.
Yeah, of course not.
Right? Just obviously. And I just saw this brilliant meme that said, like, thank God we didn't give everyone a pay rise. Otherwise, we'd have massive cost of living inflation right now.
That's because of the price setters. Like, that's something to blame on the fucking landlords. Why would we? That's the funniest thing is when prices go up or rents go up, they're like, they just went up. It's like, someone put them up. Someone made them go up. It's like, it's called rent control. Jeez. Or it's called public housing. You know that what's crazy is the real. I sometimes pay attention to this too, just because I really want rents to go down.
Of course, what's funny, we all need it to happen.
What's the funniest thing is how some of these real estate investor types they talk about how because another big thing is they talk about the tech bubble. There's an everything bubble. People are also talking about that with the housing market, and one of the things the real estate investors are saying. They're really hoping that there isn't any projects to build public housing because then they literally quote unquote, they say that they want to make sure that the supply of housing does not go up.
Yes.
This will cause their properties.
The quiet part out loud, of course. And this is the problem, obviously, the political class, it's intergenerational warfare. And, you talk about what's causing inflation. I mean, honestly, like if we privatized the fire service, would we expect the cost of fire service to go up? Like, of course it would. Like we're living in a hyper-privatized society where not only is the good privatized, but there are people investing and there's financial products made from the profits of these companies, and there's just shareholders and shareholders and shareholders all the way up, and it's just a parasitic vulture class of people. And it's not just the 1%, although it's fun to pick on them.
I think if Biden continues to raise interest rates, it definitely could, tank this house of cards. But at the state of things now, would that lead to something left, or could it lead to more far right? And I think right now it's the latter. One, because I think the left hasn't disassociated itself. First of all, I don't think there is a left in America, but like the left that we talk about colloquially, I don't think has disassociated itself from Biden enough, because there's a lot of people out there who the people have goldfish brains now, and fucking pisses me off because people talk about Biden being the one who put all this money in the economy. People forget that Trump is the one who first lowered interest rates. Like Biden's more conservative than Trump is.
It's amazing how little has changed, right? Like, and I get along better with my conservative friends when the Democrats in power, because all the criticisms they level against him, I'm like, yep, I agree.
Yeah, but then they think Trump will fix things.
When Trump was in power, I was like, but he was doing all that shit too, right? Like, the kids in the cages, when Trump was doing it, no, they're not concentration camps, they're just detention facilities. And now Biden's, they see the argument of everything that's wrong with them. So I don't want to get too much into bipartisanship. That's kind of the jam for my podcast. We have gone off on some beautiful tangents. But I will just say that Yeah, I have really enjoyed this conversation,
Yeah.
and I agree with you. And I don't know. I don't have the answers. I do think we need a revolution. I don't know whether accelerationism and maybe I want this house of cards to
You
collapse.
should look into
Um,
accelerationism. Like there's a real well, there are different types of there's a weird right wing kind, and then there's like
yeah, I mean, there was there were leftist accelerationists in Nazi Germany in the 20s and 30s, right?
yeah, I
I
don't
don't know if you're
consider
familiar.
though wanting it to collapse to be accelerationist though. Because I
I mean,
think it's more I think
yeah.
more what I think for me I view left accelerationism is exploiting the tendencies of the contradictions of the system that will lead us closer to socialism, and for the right accelerationism is exploiting the contradictions of the system that will bring us closer to like fascism or whatever kind of technocracy they want.
So I'll just say quickly, because member of my local Socialist Party chapter, and we were debating this the other night, and I found it fascinating. I think there's this big myth that we can sit around in a meeting or this chat and be like, oh, maybe we should
It
accelerate
doesn't
this or
matter, we have
that,
no
and
democracy.
we don't have the power, right?
Yeah.
We don't have enough say to do that. But this is what I said. What we do have is politics is something more than what happens every 4 to 5 years, right? Where you get to choose the color of the person up on the podium. Uh, like if we're engaged in communities and we're actually like a member of a group of people who know we've got their backs and we care about them more than just trying to win their vote for our team. Force is bigger than all of us happen, right? Like people take to the streets in their millions, and when shit like that happens, if you're a member of a strong community and have each other's back, you're in a position where your community might be one of the voices that shapes things. Can't guarantee it, can't promise it, but yeah, I think too often in these debates it becomes academic, and I think too many of the left are just stuck online arguing with each other. And if you're not a member of a community, actually helping people in their day to day, then no one's really going to join your cause just because you were good at Twitter takedowns.
What do you mean? Like that's how you get things done? Is small Marxist reading groups debating the labor theory of value, and that's how that'll make socialism happen. Of course it will.
I don't mind the small groups. I just think, yeah, farming for clout just reminds me of sort of like XP
you're telling me
grinding
that
a computer
breadtube
game.
dramas are not doing something to accelerate the cause of socialism?
I think it hits the right serotonin ding 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 in your brain that feels like it. It's like watching TV makes you feel less lonely, right?
Yeah.
I think it hits all the right synapses, but it's the methadone of you're missing out on the really good stuff.
Well,
I'm not just promoting heroin, by the way. Sorry. Today's episode sponsored by heroin.
I personally think the best thing the left can do is buy a lot of Dogecoin, then sell it all. Then the billionaires will lose all their money.
Well, I loved shorting of GameStop. I thought it was hilarious.
Those people, those libertarian dumbasses, did more to hurt capitalism than most Twitter leftists I know.
They did, but then unfortunately GameStop, with their money that they made from that, started hurting their workers and treating them like shit.
Well, that's what happens is when the stock goes up, they fire more workers. That's literally happened with Tesla. Stock go up, worker go down.
I'm so glad we did this. We should do this again. Thank you so much.
For sure. Really it was a great talk. For those listening to this podcast, definitely go check out the Beyond Binary Thinking, particularly the episode on MMT and Marxism that I was recently on. And if you're into the One Time Podcast in general, a regular listener, go check out my Patreon. I have a whole bunch of exclusive episodes now, about 14. If you want the exclusive podcast, become a patron today. What are you doing? Peace out.